Hello, everyone, and good day, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar at the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers, co-hosted by the Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs. I'm Indu Saxena, the Deputy Director with the Consortium. We at CIPR are very pleased to host this webinar focusing on the Indo-Pacific dynamism, strategic priorities, and new initiatives, and are joined today with fantastic panelists. For today's discussion, we have a team of experts on international security studies. Our esteemed speakers are Dr. Stephen R. Nagy, Professor Geoffrey F. Gresh, Professor Peter J. Dean, Dr. Jagannath Panda, Dr. Tulani Atenke, and Dr. Ernest Gunasekara-Rockwell. We will be hosting soon the next webinar in this series, so please stay tuned. I would like just to mention that we had a pre-recorded session with Dr. Tulani. Since she is based in Singapore and due to the time difference, we already had a session with her. First, I would like to invite Dr. Ernest Gunasekara-Rockwell to tell a bit about the consortium. Dr. Rockwell, the floor is yours.
Sure, thanks, Indu. As many of you know, we're entering the 5th year of production for the Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs. And over the course of this last year, thanks to some of you, we've grown exponentially. And it simply became too much for one person to be able to edit alone. So back in February, I sent out a little help SOS message onto LinkedIn and to see who would be willing to volunteer to help. I expected maybe a dozen folks would reply. Instead, I ended up with about 100 just that first month. So after wading through a ton of resumes and interviews and other people applying since then, we're at just over 60 people now on the consortium, which is an all-volunteer think tank associated with the journal, but separate from it. We're working on getting nonprofit status so that we can start doing some fundraising, providing some opportunities for some of our younger members to go to conferences and things of that nature, maybe offer some honorariums from time to time for some more distinguished authors that we can't do on the journal side of the house. And so it's a symbiotic relationship at this point, but the consortium also works with other entities as well. Our folks publish in other forums. And composition-wise, we have everything from some very advanced undergraduate students who have some publishing under their belt to advanced PhD folks and some foreign area officers, both active and retirees, and a lot of think tankers that are associated with other organizations as well. And it's really led to some vibrant collaborations with other organizations throughout the Indo-Pacific. And it's been a lot of fun. And I have to thank Indu for her help in getting these webinars up and running, and really bringing in some top-notch scholars to help us make a name for ourselves, and to also provide some additional content for the journal outside of its usual just print content. The consortium is hopeful to have its website up in the next couple of weeks. We've been working hard on it, and I've seen some prototypes. It's going to look pretty spectacular. We will start hanging some original content out there that is not associated with the Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs. It'll primarily be shorter pieces below the threshold of about 1,500 words that we use for the journal. These will be shorter, opinion pieces for the most part, but we will eventually get up into some other stuff. For example, we're working on a memorandum of understanding with the Defense Language Institute Foreign Language Center out in Monterey. We'll be working with their technology integration team to write content for their cultural orientations and country and perspective pieces, and update some of the stuff that's already out there. And in return, we'll get some additional content for our new website. So that's kind of what we're up to and kind of where we came from. So I'm not going to take up any more time because that's not what you guys are here for. I'll turn it back over to you, Indu, to introduce our stellar team of subject matter experts here. And I'll jump back in later on with some questions and some observations. So thank you.
Thanks, Doc. Now, before moving ahead, I would like to read the disclaimer. The views and opinions expressed or implied in this webinar are those of the participants and should not be construed as carrying the official sanction of the Department of Defense, Air Force, Air Education and Training Command, Air University, or other agencies or departments of the US government or their international equivalents. Moving ahead, first, please allow me to introduce today's distinguished speakers. We have Dr. Stephen R. Nagy with us. Dr. Nagy is a Senior Associate Professor at the International Christian University in Tokyo, a Fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, and a Visiting Fellow with the Japan Institute of International Affairs. He is currently the Director of Policy Studies for the Yosuka Council of Asia Pacific Studies and a Governor for the Canadian Chamber of Commerce in Japan. He was a Distinguished Fellow with the Asia Pacific Foundation from 2017 to 2020. His recent funded research projects are Sino-Japanese relation in the wake of the 2012 territorial disputes, investigating changes in Japanese business, trade, and investment strategy in China, and perception and drivers of Chinese view on Japanese and US foreign policy in the region. He is currently working on middle powers approaches to great power competition in the Indo-Pacific. His latest publications include Indo-Pacific Resilience, Prosperity, and Stability, Canada's Capabilities-Led Approach to Strategic, Free, and Open Indo-Pacific Engagement in Canadian and Japanese Free, Open Indo-Pacific Visions, Policy Perspective, Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Sino-Japanese Reactive Diplomacy as seen through the interplay of the Belt and Road Initiative and Free and Open Indo-Pacific Vision in China Report, Quad Plus, Carving Out Canada's Middle Power Role, Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs, Special Issue Quad Plus, Form versus Substance. His topic is Middle Power Priorities in the Indo-Pacific and Practical and Sustainable Ways to Contribute to the Regionalization Process. We have Professor Geoffrey F. Gresh with us. Dr. Gresh is Professor of International Relations at the College of International Security Affairs, National Defense University in Washington, D.C. He has also served as the Department Chair of International Security Studies and as CISA Director of the South and Central Asia Security Studies Program. Previously, he was a visiting fellow at Sciences Po in Paris and was the recipient of Dwight D. Eisenhower Clifford Roberts Fellowship. He also received a US Fulbright Hays Grant to teach international relations at Salahuddin University in Erbil, Iraq. He has been awarded a Rotary Ambassadorial Scholarship to Istanbul, Turkey, and a Presidential Scholarship at the American University in Cairo, Egypt. Most recently, he was named as a Hitachi CFR International Affairs Fellow, a US-Japan Foundation Leadership Fellow, and Associate Member of the Corbett Center of Maritime Policy Studies at King's College in London, and as a term member to the Council on Foreign Relations. He's the author of Gulf Security and the US Military Regime Survival and the Politics of Basing, Stanford University Press, 2015, editor of Eurasia's Maritime Rise and Global Security from the Indian Ocean to Pacific Asia and the Arctic, Palgrave Macmillan, 2018, and co-editor of US Foreign Policy in the Middle East from American Missionaries to the Islamic State, Routledge, 2019. He's also the book series editor for Palgrave Studies in Maritime Politics and Security. His most recent book, To Rule Eurasia's Waves, The New Great Power Competition at Sea, Yale University Press, was published in late 2020. His research has also appeared in such scholarly or peer-reviewed publication as World Affairs Journal, Gulf Affairs, Sociology of Islam, Caucasian Review of International Affairs, Iran and the Caucasus, the Fletcher Form of World Affairs, Turkish Policy Quarterly, Central Asia and the Caucasus Inside Turkey, Al-Nakala, War on the Rocks, and Foreign Policy. He received a PhD in International Relations and Master of Arts in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Today, he is going to speak on maritime geoeconomics and the new great game at sea. Our next speaker is Professor Peter J. Dean. Dr. Dean is Chair of Defense Studies, Director of the University of Western Australia Defense and Security Institute, and a Senior Fellow at the Perth US Asia Center. Prior to the commencement of this role, Professor Dean was Pro-Vice Chancellor Education at the UWA. He has been a Fulbright Professional Fellow and Endeavour Research Scholar in Australia, United States Alliance Studies, as well as a non-resident fellow with the Center of Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, and the Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Studies at Georgetown University in Washington, DC. Professor Dean was the founding editor of the Melbourne University Press Defense Studies series, is a member of editorial board of the Australian Army Journal, Global War Studies, and the Military Studies Journal, and a former managing editor of the journal Security Challenges. An international award-winning author, his most recent book with Brendan Taylor and Stephen Furling is After American Primacy, Imagining the Future of Australia's Defense, Melbourne University Press, 2019. Today he's going to speak on the topic AUKUS. We have Dr. Jagannath Panda with us. Dr. Panda is Research Fellow and Center Head for East Asia at the Manohar Parrikar Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis, New Delhi, India. He is the series editor for Ruthless Studies on Think Asia. Dr. Panda is the author of the book India-China Relations, Politics of Resources, Identity and Authority in Multipolar World Order, Ruthless 2017. He is also the author of the book China's Path to Power, Party, Militarily, and the Politics of State Transition, Pentagon Press 2010. Dr. Panda has also edited a number of books to his credit. Most recently, he has published an edited volume, Scaling India-Japan Cooperation in Indo-Pacific and Beyond 2025, Connectivity, Corridors, and Contours, and the Korean Peninsula and Indo-Pacific Power Politics, Status, Security at Stake, Ruthless 2020. His topic is India and the Emerging Geopolitical Order in the Indo-Pacific. I already told that we have a recorded session with Dr. Chulani Atanke. Dr. Chulani is a research fellow at Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. She obtained her PhD from Central China Normal University in Wuhan. Prior to joining ISAS, Dr. Atanke served as the director of Institute of National Security Studies, Sri Lanka, the national security think tank under the Ministry of Defense, Sri Lanka. She was a visiting lecturer at Bandaranaike Center of International Studies on Politics in South Asia and Politics in the Indian Ocean, and a research associate at the Lakshman Kadirgamar Institute for International Relations and Strategic Studies, the think tank of the Ministry of External Affairs. She has also served as an international expert at the International Study Group on Green Belt and Road, a project of UNEP and Ministry of Environmental Protection in China. She is the author of China in Sri Lanka, a comprehensive analysis of Sino-Sri Lankan bilateral relations, and her most recent publication is the edited volume titled Maritime Sri Lanka, Historical and Contemporary Perspective, published with World Scientific Singapore in 2021. She spoke on power rivalries in the Indo-Pacific, impact on small states. We have Dr. Ernest Gunasekara-Rockwell with us. Dr. Rockwell is the director of the Consortium. He is a cross-disciplinary scholar, editor, writer, researcher, and administrator with a multivariant background in publishing, social sciences, languages, writing, editing, teaching, and the military. So now, without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Stephen R. Nagy for his presentation. Dr. Nagy, please.
Thank you very much, Indu, and thank you very much to the Consortium for holding this, I think, really interesting event. It's great to be able to exchange ideas with people from different disciplinary and regional focuses. I'm here to talk about middle powers in the Indo-Pacific. So my discussion today, I'll try to be brief and focus, limit my discussion to about 8 minutes, is first defining middle powers. Second is to look at how middle powers are understanding the dynamics of the evolution of the Indo-Pacific. And three, to, I think, identify some of the priorities of Indo-Pacific middle powers. So in terms of defining middle powers, I think traditionally we have understood middle powers as being focused on normative related issues, for example, human rights, advocating democracy, good governance, human security. But I think that we've, and this has been a traditional understanding of middle powers, but we also have other understandings of middle powers, those that are focused on hierarchy, so the differential in power between larger states and middle powers and small states. And then we have discussion in some literature about functional aspects of middle powers, how middle powers find functional areas to cooperate that meet their national interests or their particular inclinations. And a good example of that is Canada advocating for the end of landmine use in war zones. So here we saw Canada in functional areas spearhead a global approach to banning landmines. So in the context of how these middle powers are thinking about the Indo-Pacific, I think what's important is that the middle powers, with recent experience of economic coercion by China, and I'm speaking specifically about Australia, but also I think South Korea, Japan, Canada, and others, I think growingly they understand that they're being squeezed between the United States and China as their strategic rivalry deepens. And they are seeing themselves either as a proactive stakeholder, such as Australia, and trying to carve out a position in which they are contributing to the region's institutionalization. Here I'm speaking of Australia, which has been very proactive, been on the forefront of working with the United States and other partners. And AUKUS is a very good example of that. To, I think, countries like Japan that are less comfortable with the military aspects of contributing to the Indo-Pacific region's regionalization. And Japan is focusing on more softer components of institutionalization, so focusing on infrastructure and connectivity, focusing on the provision of public goods to the region, focusing on good governance. And here I think that Japan has spearheaded a lot of different initiatives at a multilateral level. And I think some of the good examples are the Japan-EU EPA, the Japan-EU Infrastructure and Connectivity Initiative. But we've also seen Japan work with other strategic partners, for example, Australia and the United States in terms of providing infrastructure connectivity funding to countries within the region. And we've also seen, of course, Japan work with Australia and India in terms of a resilient supply chain initiative. And we also see Japan working as a middle power within the Quad to, again, provide different kinds of public goods to the region. And I think the Quad is a vehicle that is evolving to provide different kinds of public goods to the region. And I think we've seen that over the past several months. In particular, in September, we've seen a commitment towards the selective diversification of supply chains, in particular in this tech sector, but also the provision of healthcare infrastructure and health goods to South Asia and Southeast Asia as a means to enhance, of course, health security, but also build strategic autonomy. And then we have other middle powers that I think are, and I'll use the word searching for or carving out a role within the Indo-Pacific. And here I see Canada as a primary example, but also Germany, France, trying to understand how they fit in within the Indo-Pacific, how they can contribute to the region's institutionalization, and how they can contribute more limited capacity to the region based on their comparative advantages. And here we see we see France, Germany, Canada, and others finding opportunities to participate in the existing partnerships, such as the Quad, to provide some kind of public good to the region. And here again, we've seen in January 2021, we saw Canada participate in Quad exercises in and around Guam. We saw the Quad countries join the Peru's exercises in April in and around the Indian Ocean. And I suspect that these middle powers will find ad hoc functional ways to cooperate in different kinds of partnerships within the Indo-Pacific to provide some capacities to build the institutionalization process. And I think this will be done in existing partnerships such as the Quad. I suspect that AUKUS will be an area of cooperation moving forward, as I think the most important part of AUKUS is not so much the nuclear submarine cooperation, but rather cooperation in building a technology, a firewall that focuses on hypersonic weapons, cybersecurity, AI, and quantum computing. Here, many middle powers can contribute here in a kind of like-minded firewall of countries that contribute to these technologies. Lastly, I'd like to just touch upon how I see the middle powers looking at and trying to contribute to the Indo-Pacific region in general. And here, I think that middle powers really are conceptualizing their Indo-Pacific engagement primarily through three lenses. First is strengthening their partnership with the United States in not only a security realm, but trying to build various kinds of partnerships with the United States and existing partnerships to provide capacity to the region. I mentioned AUKUS, I mentioned the Quad, but I do think that growingly infrastructure and connectivity, health infrastructure, as well as the provision of resilience mechanisms to help with governance issues so that countries within Southeast Asia and South Asia and other parts of the littoral areas of the Indo-Pacific do become more resilient to the influence of outside forces. Second, I see that middle powers are going to form their own consortiums, if that's the way, or own multilateral organizations to chart out their own way within the Indo-Pacific. And here I see Japan as a leader, but also Australia and New Zealand. We see all three states, of course, joining the Comprehensive, Progressive, and Trans-Pacific Partnership, but at the same time, they're joining the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So we see that they're trying to be rule makers. They're trying to build new institutions within the region, but at the same time, they're not exclusive. They're still engaging with China, a really critical partner within the region, to deal with eventual critical issues such as climate change, non-traditional security issues. And lastly, I see middle powers charting out new ways to bring leverage to the challenges in the Indo-Pacific. And here, I think Canada has been one of the leaders, and I'm thinking about the joint statement or the consortium of countries that have come together against the arbitrary detention of citizens. And here, I think this is really critical, that middle powers are going to, again, form a critical mass of countries that are going to try and pressure countries that are engaged in behavior in the Indo-Pacific, which I think is deemed inappropriate or beyond the normal means of diplomacy. And here I think that Canada has taken a lead, but I think that Japan and others are going to increasingly find ways to bring middle power diplomacy to influencing both China and the United States. In the case of China, to try and decrease some of its worst instincts in terms of how it's expanding into the Indo-Pacific, but in the case of the United States, try and lobby and bring the United States into international trade agreements, or shift their policy so that it's more adaptable and more acceptable to Indo-Pacific stakeholders. And I just end with the last example. I think if we were to compare the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue 3 years ago to today, 3 years ago, it was primarily security focused. Today, it's about public goods. It's about providing public goods to Southeast Asia and South Asia, infrastructure, connectivity, health infrastructure. And I think that this has been a result of Japan and other middle powers saying, listen, we need to push the Quad in a different direction to get stakeholder buy-in in the region. I'll stop there. Thank you again.
Thank you, Professor Nagy. Like you presented very well, like about the middle powers that sometimes creates a confusion. And what are the attributes of different middle powers? Then, like, are they promoting the regionalism or are they promoting the multilateralism? So, thank you for your wonderful presentation. Now, I would like to invite Professor Geoffrey Gresh. Professor Gresh, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Indu, for the gracious presentation. Thanks very much as well to the consortium for the invitation to be here. I very much look forward to the follow-on discussion and dialogue. So I've titled my short presentation, Maritime Geoeconomics and the New Great Game at Sea. I'm going to focus on three main elements. First, looking at very much the maritime geoeconomic piece. Then second, looking at the importance of collective security, but also what comes with that as we see increased amounts of naval activity, especially in certain maritime choke points that line the Indo-Pacific. And the last point is to look at strategic basing, especially from a US standpoint, and the importance of securing the sea lanes of communication. So first, as we know, the maritime geoeconomics really fits front and center in this larger conversation because the outward push by China or India or Russia, for that matter, or other European powers, other middle powers, as mentioned by the prior speaker, is much driven by the importance of geoeconomics. This, as we know, 90% of goods traversing the sea, of course, Southwest Asia, the Middle East, the Persian Gulf, energy is going to fit front and center in all of this. And so it's critical to ensure that not only are the vessels traversing in an open and free Indo-Pacific, but the reality is that countries have to leave their own territorial boundaries and go and seek goods from outside. So this is pushing very much states to kind of think about more from a geoeconomic standpoint, how their investments align with national interests. And when I say, geoeconomics, it can be trade policy, investment policy, cybersphere, aid, monetary policy, energy and commodity policy. All these kind of fit into this larger framework of economic statecraft or geoeconomics. What's of real further interest to me personally is that of a growing and very critical area, that of the cybersphere and the maritime cybersecurity, the maritime cyber or submarine networks that line the cable floors across the Indo-Pacific. And as most don't appreciate, there are approximately 400 submarine cables that line the entire world. And for most countries, there's only about one or two, some have more certainly, or in the case of Djibouti, there are about 7 or 8 submarine cables that come in and out of the country. So the connectivity is critical, and fascinating enough that on an annual basis, around 65% to 75% of all breaks or concerns or malfunctions of the cables are actually due to either biting of sharks, or that of an anchor coming down on a particular cyber cable, and this being very, because the cables can easily break. So security of the cyber connections that line the ocean's floor is going to be so essential moving forward. And the Chinese in particular, the Indians for that matter too, have invested increasingly over the years. There's one or several pipeline, or I should say submarine networks, cyber submarine networks that are in part, and these are global consortiums. So they're telecommunications firms. The Chinese in some cases are taking a leading edge, but it's a conglomeration of European actors, of other powers, local or national telecommunications firms that are also investing. But 3 in particular line the Indian Ocean floor that go and travel from Marseille, France, for example, all the way through the Suez Canal, through the Bab el-Mandeb into the Indian Ocean. It looks very much, if you overlay it on a map, of the maritime Silk Route. And this Siwi-Mi, as it's called, the Southeast Asia, Western Europe, connects to the Middle East. They've laid a series of these the 3, 4, and 5 Siwi-Mi over the past decade or so. But understanding that power is knowledge, and securing information highways that travel in the maritime domain are going to become increasingly important as we move forward. And because there's so few, if you look at the other eastern edge of the Indian Ocean, there are approximately 12 or 13 that go through the Strait of Malacca, that travel through the Andaman Sea. 50% are about India, tied to India or India conglomerations, and about 50% related to the Chinese. Of course, there are other actors in there too, important actors related to Southeast Asia. But it just, to pointing at the criticality of geoeconomics, especially as our economies are so increasingly tied to the political economy. And certainly the last main point, to just hit home the importance of the cyber cables. 94% of all of our communications, whether it's phone or internet, et cetera, traverse these important submarine networks. So from the geoeconomics, it spills over into the security realm. And of course, as growing geoeconomic investments, it means that you have to secure those investments. And so we're seeing a really influx in certainly in the maritime sphere again, of collective security, of joint naval exercises, and of just greater presence of naval forces on the high seas, especially in the Indian Ocean, but certainly in East Asia too. And there's a whole long list. We won't go into all of them here, certainly, but it's just to point out that India, the United States, Japan, Australia, and other smaller middle powers are equally kind of engaged in wanting to get domain awareness, of wanting to promote, especially from the US standpoint or India's standpoint, wanting to promote interoperability. And interoperability is so key and critical for, especially if there's the likelihood of further outbreak, or they want to do joint maneuvers in spaces that are not necessarily territorial waters. It's important to share information. And India has certainly been at the forefront of this. The United States, of course, through with India and Japan, or the Quad on the high seas, through the Malabar exercise, which is pretty noteworthy over the last couple of years, but specifically last year, adding Australia into the mix was important. But we're also seeing the European powers send out ships into the Indo-Pacific. Of course, the British, United Kingdom sending the Queen Elizabeth, the Germans sending the Bayern on a 6-month mission into the South China Sea for the first time in 2 decades. The French, of course, in April of this past year, hosting a naval exercise along with the Quad. And so showing that, there are more investment, more interest generating. But the challenge that lies is the greater increased likelihood for the outbreak of inadvertent conflict, or an accident, that it could escalate into something else. It's a classic security dilemma. So certainly the Indian Ocean is a massive body of water, but we know in places like the Bab el-Mandeb and certainly the Strait of Malacca, or if you move into the South China Sea, they're much more congested areas. And as you have more navies that are more, especially in the case of Russia and or China, that are more seen as being more aggressive towards other, it creates an additional tension that also needs to be kind of examined and hopefully, doesn't escalate into something else. But I think there's good reason behind why there's kind of this movement towards greater naval exercises, greater push for collective security, and certainly why AUKUS is such a significant moment. And certainly I look forward to hearing our colleagues' presentation on that. But that, gets at how, kind of the push towards burden sharing, especially from a US standpoint, knowing that we can't be everywhere all at the same time. And so trying to work with our partners and allies to increase, kind of a co-collaboration and more interoperability. So the last point, and this spills over into, securing the sea lanes of communication. but also the importance of strategic military basing. Every year, the United States, or every couple of years for that matter, the United States Department of Defense publishes what they call the base structure report. And here they talk about the main operating bases that exist around the world. Now, there's a real semantics to definitions behind bases. How do you define a base? What's a cooperative security location? What's a forward installation? So we certainly get into the semantics there. But nevertheless, the United States has anywhere between 500 and 600 main operating bases around the world. Now, some have put that estimate at much higher, based again on how they define it. But nevertheless, 500 to 600 is a very significant number. Even so, there's a big gap if you look at where the United States has its strategic basing. We're all over the Southwest Asia, the Middle East, of course. We have the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. We have AUKUS in the UAE. Qatar is important, Al Udeid Air Base. And Djibouti, of course, being a great hub for all international actors, from Japan to China to the European powers, to the United States, etc. But our main base really for us is Diego Garcia. And then there's more or less nothing else in the Indian Ocean. And this, I think, is going to be of why the United States is trying to push more with AUKUS, but also of trying to delicately kind of work more with the Indians, seeing how they can kind of fill the holes in the kind of push east, the next significant base for us, before you get into, of course, the first island chain, Japan and Korea. And our other islands in the Pacific, from Guam, etc., is Darwin, Australia. And currently we have about 2,200 Marines. With AUKUS, this will certainly shift. And, because I think the main operating base, or submarine base, I should say, in Australia is that of Perth. So far removed still. And so there'll be much maneuvering, if you will, because the United States really has to figure out, because of its Seventh Fleet based in Japan is so spread thinly, pushing into the Indian Ocean that's so far away, and then just trying to figure out how to strategically create your forward posture, how you then interlink and align and work with others is going to be a real challenge moving forward. So with that, I'll end it. Again, going from the maritime geoeconomics, pushing into the collective security realm, but then ultimately moving into strategic basing and sea lanes of communication of being some of the larger challenges and dynamics to think about and focus on moving forward across the Indo-Pacific. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Gresh, for your wonderful presentation. How you started with the maritime geoeconomics and the economic statecraft, and you just discussed about how the importance of the choke points and the sea lanes, and now it ends to the classical security dilemma. So, and lastly, the question comes here, like now when it comes to the strategic basing, so the small states and the middle powers in the region, how they react with the great powers. Thank you. Now I would like to invite our next speaker, Professor Peter J. Dean. Professor Dean, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Indu, and thank you to the consortium for the invitation. And actually, thank you to Stephen and Jeff, who've actually given me a really fantastic lead into what I'm going to talk about today. So obviously, Australia sees itself very much and identifies itself very much as a middle power. It likes to even sort of use the concept or idea of it being a creative middle power. And certainly, as Stephen pointed out, it's at various times been involved in very normative functions, been involved in very functional areas. And it certainly, I agree, is one of those states who's being squeezed at the moment between a strong economic relationship with China and, of course, its very strong strategic partnership with the United States, as is happening to many countries in the region as well. And certainly Australia's response to that, say, if you can contrast it to some other middle power states in the region, has been to be a very proactive stakeholder and deeply engaged and on the front foot in terms of articulating its sovereign interests in the region. Jeff's obviously talked about the great game at STEAM, and so my topic's on AUKUS, and so the intersection between that middle power notion and, of course, what's happening at sea, because very much since AUKUS was announced, has been dominated by the headline about the sharing of nuclear submarine technology between the United States, Great Britain, and most significantly a nuclear submarine program for Australia. So I just wanted to talk for a few minutes today about some of the rationale and ramifications of AUKUS, talk a little bit about submarines, but actually enhance, I think, on some of the other areas that have been largely lost because of the dominance of the nuclear submarine question in the commentary. But also add a little bit of where Australia, I suppose, in Stephen's term, is struggling with its middle power diplomacy, particularly in the way that the AUKUS announcement was made and some of the ramifications that's had. So if you look at AUKUS from an Australian perspective, and certainly a US-Australia bilateral strategic partnership, this is actually about a great deal of continuity. It's really about extending a path that Australia and the United States have been on now for decades in terms of their bilateral strategic partnership. If you go back and look particularly at the deep engagement Australia had with the United States military operations in the Middle East, be they from the first Gulf War through to the invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan, the operations against ISIS, etc. You've seen a real deepening of cooperation, particularly at the military level, and particularly on interoperability. With the rise of China, you've also seen some significant moves in the Australia-United States strategic partnership in the region, as basically the ANZUS alliance has been refocused back to an Indo-Pacific frame. We're very much at the end of the Cold War. Even though if you actually read the text of the ANZUS treaty, it talks about it being a Pacific Pact at that sort of unipolar moment, as Charles Krauthammer mentioned. The alliance certainly went global, but as the rise of China has occurred in the last few years, but particularly from around about 2009, the focus of that strategic partnership has very much shifted back to Asia, or the Indo-Pacific, as now it's referred to both in Australian and US strategic discussions. So this is very traditionally Australian. Australia's traditional approach to balancing what's happening in the region is to have a great and powerful friend. First of all, it was Great Britain and now the United States. So this is what makes it interesting that the sort of British are almost back on some small level, despite their withdrawal behind east of Suez in the 1960s. But it's a very traditional Australian approach to combine having a much deeper relationship with its great and powerful friend, with its major ally. So very much in terms of what we're talking about here, the great powers to the small states. There's a middle power getting closer to its great power friend in the region, but combining that with multilateral diplomacy. And as we've heard mentioned, this is particularly evident through the Quad. What Australia has also done is look at closer bilateral relationships. It's formed and signed strategic partnerships with Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia in the last couple of years. And of course, most significant last year, it signed a strategic partnership and much greater defence cooperation with India in 2020. And that has been really also another level of importance of our relationship with India that's been expanding in recent years, and very much a focus also around the Quad. AUKUS here is basically a technology sharing and cooperative technology sharing arrangement, and that's really what the focus is. And I think a lot of that has been missed by the overwhelming dominance of the nuclear submarine question. That the real headline here is the depth of engagement that these three countries have decided to enter into these areas. But of course, from the media and commentary point of view, nuclear submarines seem so much more interesting and so much more sexy. So that's really dominated. And certainly from the Australian point of view, our domestic media have gone sort of ballistic on this and sort of lost the broader focus of what this broader partnership is really about. And certainly that I've seen that reflected in some of the regional commentary as far afield as having to do media in South America, the Middle East, Europe, and pretty much all over the globe, as I've done in the last few weeks. What's really important here when you strip it back and look at it is what this is really about is the technological industrial base and supply chains. And what it's really highlighting, and we've seen this reflected in some of the conversations in the Quad and other minilateral forums in the region as well. This is the area of 21st century competition. And in this is where these three countries are looking to particularly work more closely in the areas of quantum technology, biotechnology, artificial intelligence, space, cyber, data, disinformation and propaganda, foreign interference, as well as economic coercion, critical infrastructure, supply chain disruption, and many others. And when you look at it from a much more military point of view, one thing that was sort of missed besides the AUKUS agreement about nuclear submarines, if you go back and look at it, what is actually quite a short document, and so I keep pointing out only a less than 12-minute press conference that gave us AUKUS last month. It also talked about the transfer of other capabilities to Australia, Tomahawk missiles for our air warfare destroyers, the joint air-to-surface standoff extended range missiles for the F-35, long-range anti-ship missiles for our F-18s and F-35s, hypersonic technology, precision-guided munitions, and accelerated guided weapons manufacturing and shipbuilding talent pool, which I think is particularly interesting. Commitment from all three countries to support the Australian life of extension of our existing conventional class submarines starting in 2026. And a $5.1 billion upgrade to our air warfare destroyers, which is significant given that these ships have only literally just entered service. So this is about trying to maintain them at the most cutting edge technology. So that sharing, technology sharing piece is really important. There's been a lot of, I think a little bit of misinformation and disinformation about AUKUS being an alliance, particularly in some of the regional commentary, which it's not. And it's certainly not, well, I think an absolutely critical and very important partnership to be signed. It's sort of not in the pantheon of the ANZUS alliance, which was signed back in 1951, or some other things like our own prime ministers tried to claim, but that's more about domestic political credits more than anything else. I'd like to just point out on this that the OSMIN meeting, which is the 2+2 meetings between Australia and the United States, was held on the same day. And this would normally be a very strong focus of discussion around the bilateral relationship. And of course, it got almost no coverage given that the AUKUS announcement overruled it, but there was actually very significant moves within the OSMIN statement. It certainly backed up many of the discussions that were happening around the Quad leaders meeting obviously happening in DC around the same time. It had some particularly interesting language where it spoke specifically about the Taiwan issue that's been of great concern to many countries in the region. But the key area, I think, was about force posture, and this is what Geoff was also talking about as well. So it talked in that document about enhanced air cooperation. So we've had, as Geoff mentioned, the Marines rotating through Darwin, but this also gives a very significant enhancement to the United States Air Force, and particularly what it points out to all US aircraft types. So a particular hint here to the strategic level assets that the US forces and capabilities it have that will be operating out of Northern Australia. And we've seen a significant enhancement of Australia's airfields in the north around Darwin to be able to take larger US aircraft to strategic types in recent years. And that's largely flown under the radar, but become much more prominent in the OSMIN announcement. Enhanced maritime cooperation by increasing logistics and sustainment capabilities for both US surface and subsurface vessels in Australia, which is an indication that we're going to see much greater United States Navy assets operating in the Australian region or out of Australian ports, and enhanced land cooperation through greater exercises and engagement with allies and partners in the region. And most significantly, I think what was talked about was an establishment of a combined logistics and sustainment and maintenance enterprise. Now, this is where Geoff said strategic basing comes in many forms. Australia doesn't like to talk about other countries having or United States having bases in Australia. We talk about joint facilities or shared facilities or the rotation of forces through Australia. But in essence, what a combined logistics, sustainment and maintenance enterprise is a joint base between Australia and the United States that will be there to exist to basically enable the rotation of those forces and the more steady rotation of forces. And what's been very interesting in Australia in recent years is that there's actually quite significant public support for the addition of US forces in Australia. Now, the one thing I'll say as a caveat to this is offset that most of these force posture agreements were actually announced back in 2012, 2013 between the Gillard government and the Obama government, which started with the outline of the Marine rotation through Darwin. What we see here is an enhancement of this, but it's basically goes to point out that this particular element has been pretty slow in developing in the Australia-US bilateral relationship, and it's taking on much greater emphasis and importance given the current strategic climate. I'll also talk about HMAS Sterling here in Perth. This was outlined back in 2012-13 as one of these areas for expansion. And of course, at the end of the Trump regime, as Geoff mentioned, the issues about coverage for Indo-Pacific Command, It was the first fleet idea was floated for Singapore. Certainly the commentary in Australia would have been that it would have been much better for a discussion like that, if at all possible, given the force constraints of the US Navy in the region, to actually talk about HMAS Sterling and Perth in relation to that. And I think we get some type of hint towards that in the OSMIN statement as well. What's consistent between both AUKUS and OSMIN is a discussion around resilient, diverse and secure supply chains. This is about economic prosperity, national security, and multilateral cooperation in these critical sectors. And this is very much an important part of where the focus of enhancement of this bilateral relationship in AUKUS really is. The Secretaries and Ministers in OSMIN signed a classified statement of intent on strategic capabilities and implementation, particularly focus about defence industrial base integration. And I think this sounds boring, doesn't sound overly interesting, but I actually think is one of the most critical areas in development. And I think the bigger headline here for AUKUS is what we're seeing is the United States having recognition of its relative decline of power compared to the rise of other states in the region. And how does it enhance its posture, its presence, its balance of power and its commitment to the region? Well, in working more closely with some of its key alliance partners about the aggregation of power, which ultimately is what alliance is about. And this aggregation of power is now moving into new domains, and particularly, as I said, on those high-end technology transfers and cooperations, but also the defence industrial base. One of the other critical announcements that's been made in this partnership too has been Australia's commitment to a sovereign missile capability, and that's going to be very dependent upon this technology transfer between these countries, and of course very dependent upon the US industrial base integration piece, which is going to be absolutely key and critical. And I think what we've seen is the enhancement of this relationship into some new areas. To sum it up, I've specifically tried to avoid the nuclear submarine question too much because that's stolen so many of the headlines. But if you look at it from an Australian strategic point of view, a nuclear submarine is an absolute no-brainer, particularly given the distances involved. If you look, for instance, at an operational area of the South China Sea, based on some publicly available data, our current submarines can spend a patrol time of about 11 days in the South China Sea. You move to nuclear power and you're looking at a 77 to 88 day operational time in that area. That's a significant enhancement, of course, and all the wonderful things that nuclear technology bring in terms of power, which will allow advanced sensors, advanced weapon systems, and of course, more autonomous systems to be operated by submarines of this type. The greater problem we have in Australia is actually not the cost, it's actually not the political debate, it's not even the sovereign industrial base that we'll need to develop, is the fact that Australia in its 2020 strategic update announced an end of 10 years of warning time for major conflict in the region. It's put submarines at the front and centre of its new posture around deterrence as a key strategic objective. And now we're going to look at not getting nuclear powered submarines to sometime into the 2030s or even to the 2040s, which seems a very long distance away. And the other offset of this was the very poor diplomacy that Australia had in handling this. Obviously, the French are very upset. They have every right to be on some levels. But if the French hadn't been aware that the submarine deal that we had with them was under threat, then the French naval group operating that program hadn't read anything in the Australian media for over a year, because about every other week there'd been very great concerns and leaks from the Australian government about how much peril that particular program had been in. But I think it's important to look at the reactions around the region. The Australian diplomacy was not done very well with France nor countries in the region, but I think what's been very positive is that whilst we've had some hesitation from Malaysia and particularly Indonesia, they've sort of come around to understanding the rationale for this. Very strong support from Japan, from Korea, from the Philippines, from Singapore and other states. So I think while a lot of focus again has been on the sort of very strong reaction of the French and that's stolen the headlines, what's sort of gone under the radar is actually the largely positive response from those states, from India and others into the region, which I think has been very important. So I'll finish up there.
Thank you, Professor Dean, for your insight on AUKUS, nuclear submarine deal, and how it is different. AUKUS is different from other alliances, and why nuclear sub for Australia. Thanks for your presentation. Now I would like to invite Dr. Jagannath Panda. Dr. Panda, please.
Thank you, Indu, for this invitation. And let me at the outset thank Dr. Ernest Gunasekara-Rockwell for this kind invitation. And it's a pleasure to be here in this panel. And I think I am asked to speak on India and the emerging geopolitical order in Indo-Pacific. Let me share some of my ideas about how does really India is looking at the emerging geopolitics in the regions and how India is responding to the challenges in the neighborhood, to the global challenges that is coming in new form. And I think what we are seeing in the post-pandemic period is that there are new types of challenges have come up. And it is not only the challenge, the traditional challenge that India has been facing in the regions, but there are challenges of trying to adjust with the new kind of politics at the transatlantic zone, particularly the kind of power politics emerging in the European continent, factoring Europe's relationship with US, Europe's relationship with the rest of the Asian countries. And to that effect, I think India is continuously watching the geopolitical developments in the regions. But I think what we need to take into account that how Indian foreign policy is adjusting to the new challenges. And therefore, I would go with a little bit with a background by saying that I think we need to take a comprehensive analysis of Indian foreign policy, how it has evolved all this while. And about Indian foreign policy, I think one point which is clearly visible is that Indian foreign policy has become very mature and is becoming very versatile. There is a new mode of engagement which is taking place in Indian foreign policy, and the mode of engagement is based on a path of pluralism. Pluralism of trying to engage with the different powers, be it major powers, be it smaller powers, or most interestingly, be it middle powers, even though we know for a fact that there is a lack of definition, conformist definitions about middle powers. But on a notional concept, I think middle powers as a concept is first emerging. As previous speakers, Professor Nagy pointed out, that there are like-minded countries in Asia and in the Indo-Pacific regions who are clubbed as a middle powers. And I think India is viewing this state of power configuration in its foreign policy much more seriously than earlier. And therefore, there is a path of pluralism in India's foreign policy path, and that is clearly visible, which is a much more mature foreign policy. And therefore, India is looking at the new challenges, new issues in a new context in terms of engaging through different power modes. But within that configuration, I think what is becoming more visible and clearer is that India's importance and India's significance to the Quad process with the US, with Japan, and with Australia. And I think what was arguing, what was all of this while many scholars were arguing that probably India was not really serious about the Quad process. But what we saw is that India trying to respond to the situation and trying to take Quad process much more seriously than earlier. In fact, what we are seeing today is that after the virtual leadership summit and the physical leadership summit, India is trying to see the Quad process not only much more seriously, but trying to complement the kind of relationship it is orchestrating with individual Quad countries, be it with the US, be it with Japan, with Australia, in fact, with the US. What we have seen is that there is a significant amount of focus in Indian foreign policy to develop India-US relationship, to make it much more defense and security-oriented partnership. But at the same time, what we saw after Prime Minister Modi's recent visit to the US is that the India-US canvas of relationship is becoming much more comprehensive. And this is what we are seeing, which is a very, very pointed engagement strategy in Indian foreign policy, that India is looking at US as a much more confident partner in Indo-Pacific regions. Even though there are many issues that between India and US are not really resolved or not really yet sorted out, but still I think both India and US are looking at the complementarities of the issues that they can really take forward. For example, we can say that probably traditionally India and US were not on the same page when it comes to the Iran issue, when it came to the terrorism issue, when it came to Pakistan issue, where issues like North Korea. There were a range of issues that India and US were not together. But I think there has been a great convergence of interest, and I think there is a newfound interest in both the countries about addressing the regional security issues, and this is what making India-US partnership a much more comprehensive partnership in Indo-Pacific countries, and that is a welcome news for the Quad process. When it comes to India-Japan partnerships, we have seen that probably India-Japan economic partnership has been one of the statement in the Indo-Pacific regions, and it has been a referral point for many countries in the regions. And the way Japan is actually investing in India, particularly in India's domestic constituencies, in road infrastructure, in railway, and in infrastructure and connectivity issues, I think that is making India and Japan partnership much more a confident partnership. But I think what we saw in the post-pandemic period is that the signing of the AUKUS agreement between India and Japan has brought a new kind of confidence in these partnerships. And today, what we are seeing, even though there is a leadership change is happening in Japan, and even though Prime Minister Abe Shinzo is still not there, and there has been a frequent leadership change after Suga, now we are seeing a new leadership has come up that is in the name of Prime Minister Kishida. Still, I think India-Japan relationship, India-Japan partnership is on a safe track, and it is going to proceed further. On the other hand, what we are seeing is that India's partnership with Australia is also witnessing a constant change and evolutionary progress, and that is a point to be noted. In fact, there has been a critical note in the Indo-Pacific regions about India-Australia partnerships, but what today we are seeing is that there is a newfound synergies happening, not only at the bilateral level, but at the regional level. At a bilateral level, Australia has a much more concentrated South Asia policy and India-focused policy. In fact, Australia has a much more engagement policy towards engaging with India's coastal regions, be it in the southern or in the western coastal regions in the Indian Ocean regions. But on the Indo-Pacific regions, and I think there is a new complementarity is emerging, where Australia has been invited to be a part of the Malabar exercise, and I think that has given a new fillip to the India-Australia partnership, complementing the Quad process. So therefore, I think if we try to understand from India's point of view, India has shown enormous interest to take the Quad process forward, and that is in terms of responding to the new emerging geopolitical issues in the regions. The other critical issues are, I think, the kind of nexus is emerging, and this nexus is not in terms of so much on a factual note, but more in terms of notional context, in terms of creating a conducive environment and trying to complement each other's policies and action plan. For example, trying to have a much more complementary note with Japan, with Australia, with Canada, with the United Kingdom, and with the European Union mainstream countries. And this is what we are talking about, a middle power approach or a middle power nexus that India is really serious about. There are three specific issues I would like to touch upon before I stop, and invite comments. One is the infrastructure politics, to which India is showing a lot of interest. We know for a fact that India is an emerging economy, and there are different theses attached to India's emergence. Some might call it India as an emerging power. Some might say India is a major power in Indo-Pacific today. Some might call India as a middle power. But one thing is becoming clearer, that India in its Indo-Pacific approach, India in its versatile, matured, pluralistic foreign policy, factoring infrastructure politics, infrastructure and connectivity, plan of actions as one of the key features in its foreign policy. And therefore, what we are seeing is that India is supporting the BDN framework, the Blue Dot networks that is there, between US, Australia, and Japan. Even though this is a tripartite framework, which is among the major economies, which is among the developed economies to support the infrastructure finance. India being an emerging economy, still India is supporting the BDN process and trying, considering positively to be a part of the BDN process. In fact, during the G7 plus summit, what we saw that, there is a talk about B3W initiatives. And India is, all for the B3W initiatives. Built a better back a world initiatives, which is all about connectivity, infrastructure promotion, and trying to have transparent infrastructure development in the Indo-Pacific regions. And there are also, if we try to see it on a broader canvas, there are greater issues, security issues, to which India is, if India is not outrightly really committing to provide security, but India is definitely supporting the greater action plan of the major powers. For example, on critical security issues like Taliban, on Taliban issues, probably India has a much more focused and much more pointed standpoint on the Taliban issues, because India has been a victim of terrorism for a long time. But when it comes to reconstruction of Afghanistan, India has been supporting the US-led action plan in the regions, and India has actually supported a lot of construction process, infrastructure construction process within the Afghanistan. So therefore, India would like to see that the Taliban, the interim government, trying to form a very credible government, disassociating and disbanding the act of terrorism. For example, on the issue of Taiwan, and on the issue of Taiwan, I think the regional politics is heating up, but it is time for many countries to show solidarity with the cause of Taiwan and support and provide Taiwan. And to that effect, India would like to support probably that the status quo in the cross-strait ties should be maintained. On the issue of South China Sea, on East China Sea, India is showing a lot of strategic overtures to support freedom of navigations. And I think to that effect, Indian foreign policy is maturing up, and it is so of a versatile foreign policy. In fact, on the issue, my last point is on the issue of AUKUS. AUKUS is a new development, definitely, and it has created probably a lot of debate across the world. And probably we have seen some kind of tensions in the transnational ties between Europe and US, and particularly between France and US. But I think India has, if not overtly, India has, covertly definitely seen the AUKUS development as a positive signal to the Indo-Pacific security undertaking. In fact, we have tried to say that AUKUS is a new development, and it should be seen as a positive development. And in fact, even though India views that there are gray areas that needs to be studied carefully, but India does see the AUKUS development as a conducive plan, as a complementary plan to the Quad process. And therefore, I think the partnership that is emerging through Australia, United Kingdom, and US, India welcomes such a partnership. In fact, particularly to the United Kingdom's overtures towards Indo-Pacific and the role UK is trying to play in Indo-Pacific regions, India is very forthcoming and positive about that. So therefore, I would conclude by saying that India is emerging as a critical facilitator of the security undertaking in the Indo-Pacific. It is a critical power to the US undertaking in the regions. It is a critical partner for Japan, also a critical partner for the middle powers in the regions. And probably India's role and significance in Indo-Pacific is going to enlarge, is going to expand. And I think what India would like to see, that the security in Indo-Pacific should be of a shared nature, and India would beg for a collective security rather than a security of a unilateral action plan. And I think this is what India is talking about in its Indo-Pacific foreign policy. If we try to understand Prime Minister Modi's speech to the current action plan, and I think India is talking about universal security in Indo-Pacific, of a freedom of navigation, and also of a collective security. I would stop here and probably welcome your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Panda, for your insight on India's foreign policy, its emerging attributes of versatile and mature foreign policy, of infrastructure and connectivity, and the comprehensive and historical partnership between India and the United States. But still, there are more room to come together, like you told about the Iran, North Korea, and Taliban, and basically terrorism, cross-border terrorism, and buying S-400 from Russia. So these are some concerns. Then we need to work on that India's foreign policy. And of course, there's a debate in Indian strategic thinkers between AUKUS, taking to the AUKUS is helpful or not, or it's India's losing importance. A kind of debate is going on. Our next speaker is Dr. Chulani Atanke. Her topic is power rivalry in the Indo-Pacific, impact on small states. Dr. Chulani, please.
Thank you, Dr. Indu, and thank you, Professor Rockwell, Gunasekara, GPA, for this opportunity to share my thoughts during this eminent panel. So as Dr. Indu already mentioned, I'll be briefly talking about the power rivalry in the Indo-Pacific region and looking at it from a more small states perspective. So when I say the Indo-Pacific region, most of my examples will be coming from the Indian Ocean region. I have to admit that first, because my recent research are more concentrated on this part of the Indo-Pacific. But I hope the discussion will be able to see whether there are some similarities in the other part of the Indo-Pacific to what I'll be sharing right now. So historical, as we know, ocean space and sea power has been always a determinant in great power competitions. And during the more recent history, Great Britain came victorious from the 7 years of war because it exploited their naval powers with amphibious descents. And at the end of the 7 years of war, the Kingdom of Great Britain have already become the British Empire. So this historical reality has later led to America and other major powers to look at naval power as a major component in their strategic thinking. So that's why we have the concepts like Mahan's sea power and Spike's Rimland theory, etc. In a recent book, Professor Rory Medcalf mentions that Indo-Pacific is a code name for geopolitical agendas, and which is America's bid to contain China, India's agenda to become a great power, Australia's to alliance building, Europe's opportunity to return to Asian space, and gate crash the Asian century. So within this framework, we tend to see a lot of competing strategies where India has the security for growth, security and growth for all regions, which they call as SAGR, and then they have Look East policy or the Act East policy, and they also have something called Think West policy. From China's, they have Maritime Silk Road, which is half of the Belt and Road Initiative, focusing specifically on the maritime route. And then recently, Japan and United States have their own definition of free and open Indo-Pacific, and now which has also transformed into the quadrilateral dialogue. So we see a number of competing strategies in the Indo-Pacific region during the last decade, I would say, since the beginning of the 21st century. I'm sure the discussion will talk about the reasons, and we talk extensively why this is happening with regard to China's rise, increase in competition for the resources, etc. So I won't touch too much upon that. What I want to highlight another key factor about the Indo-Pacific power competition is that this is a multipolar system, but also it includes minilateral alliances where 2 or 3 countries coming together to address a mutually agreed agenda. For instance, the quadrilateral dialogue, or the India, Australia, Indonesia, Japan, India, Australia. So you have number of minilateral dialogue alliances within this multipolar system. The other aspect is that, as I said, these major powers are competing for resources such as energy and raw materials, and this has led to make sea lanes as maritime highways. And they're also competing for connectivity within the region with one another. Now, where does small states fall within this framework? So that is what I want to address mainly in my presentation here. So first, I must note that there is no general consensus on the definition of a small state. The scholars use quantifiable characteristics and all such as geographic area, population, etc. And some uses qualitative characteristics where they compare a country with another country which is closely located next to it, and compare which country, then consider the smaller country as a smaller power. So when I refer to small states in this presentation, I'm not necessarily using referring to a quantifiable or qualitative aspect of it. I'm just loosely using it to refer to these countries. So because of these, as I mentioned in earlier, there are a number of rising tensions and competition within the major players in the Indo-Pacific region. So because of this, there is a race for connectivity. China and the other countries are connecting to build ports, roads, railroads, electricity, communications, infrastructure, etc., which are meant to connect Africa, Europe, Pacific, and Asia. So this is a concept, I think, that is going way beyond the globalization that we have experienced so far. And this connectivity race has extended to small island states in the Indian Ocean and South Pacific, as we have seen in the examples of Sri Lanka, Seychelles, Mauritius, or Maldives, or even countries like Bangladesh, Myanmar. Everywhere we see these connectivity race happening among the major powers, be it China, India, US, India, China, India, China, US, Australia, like in the Pacific. So we see this competition happening in a similar pattern in every part of the Indo-Pacific region. And this has made the connectivity, which is an economic aspect, partly a competition, a tool of influence. So which in scholarly terms you refer to as geoeconomics. And the major players use the small states as their battleground when they try to compete for gaining influence by building roads, these major infrastructure, like in, for instance, ports in Sri Lanka, etc. Now, how, if I take Sri Lanka as an example, because that is one of my major research areas, we see India and China has been competing extensively to invest in number of areas, whether it's building houses for the communities, whether it's water purification projects, energy projects, ports, railroads. We see a very fierce competition between India and Sri Lanka. I think the most popular example is the competition in the port industry. Hambantota port is often taken as an example of China's debt trap diplomacy by the Indian and Western scholars, while of course there are other data that is coming up, which sort of challenge the debt trap diplomacy, which is not really a part of this presentation. But so the reason for all this is, I think, that the competition for influence through infrastructure investment, because now the most recent example is Adani Group taking over the Colombo Port's Western Terminal. So those who follow Sri Lanka's port infrastructure and competition within the port infrastructure, you know the story where first, India was invited to invest in Hambantota port, but then they rejected at that time. But then when the Chinese investment came, there was a lot of concerns raised within India. And then during the same time, China also started investing in another terminal in the Colombo port. With all these developments, India sort of came up and showed main interest in investing in Sri Lankan ports. Now, this is something that we can discuss for a very long time, because particularly in Sri Lankan case, Chinese investments in the country has been a catalyst for India to increase its engagement and sort of refine its policy of engagement with Sri Lanka over the past decade. So, because of that, in my observation, great power competition is not always a bad thing for small states. For small states, a competition of this status quo, where they don't get into traditional military confrontation, it is an opportunity. And whether, if you look at all the small states in South Asian neighborhood, for instance, be it Nepal, Bangladesh, Maldives, Sri Lanka, they have benefited from the India and China's competition, because they get an opportunity to strategically hedge between the two players to realize their economic interest. They get more bargaining power. Because of that, as I mentioned, you see a pattern of India's different ways of engagement in South Asian region in its own neighborhood after China increased its presence in this neighborhood. So I'm sure that I'm not so sure whether I don't have enough data to say this is the same reality in, say, South Pacific, but I'm sure it will be interesting to see whether you see a similar pattern in that area also, whether Chinese entrance into this part of the geographical spaces whether that has been a catalyst for other major players like United States, Australia, Japan to increase their engagement or change their approach in dealing with these countries. So this competition has also changed the way how these major players engage in terms of security partnerships and engagement. Again, India has intensified its security partnership in small South Asian countries, and even United States is seen building military partnerships. For instance, in 2018, Sri Lanka was invited to be a partner in the RIMPAC exercise. And in 2020, Bangladesh and US launched joint naval exercise, which is called CARAT. So these are all, I think, effect of China's increasing engagement in this part of the region. Now, what are the challenges for the small countries? In a near worst case scenario, that would be a challenge of a war, because all majority of these major countries, especially United States, China, and India, are nuclear powers. So the question is whether that, in a worst case scenario where if they go for a physical war, then where would these small states be stand, and how it will affect them? Because definitely they will be pushed, whether they will be pushed to take a side. If so, which side they can take? So these are questions that I think challenge the small states in the long run. And another challenge is also that increasingly we are talking about with regard to Indian Ocean region is the militarization of the Indian Ocean region. Since 1970s onwards, even during the Cold War, the Indian Ocean region had this concern whether a great power rivalry will eventually militarize the region. If that happens, militarize the Indian Ocean region and how that would affect the peace of the region. So that's why I think there were proposals like Indian Ocean as a zone of peace. But the question again right now is whether we can sort of push for a similar agenda when one of the major players in the great power rivalry is India, and it is already a nuclear power, and it is mainly involved in this great power competition. So can we push to small states alone? Can they push for Indians ocean zone of peace anymore? So this is another question I think that would bother the small states. Third aspect is again, it's related to what I said earlier also about the polarization, whether they will be pushed to choose between two different polars, and whether they will be pushed to make a decision or choose one over the other. Because at the moment they are more comfortable in sitting in the middle and going to both sides whenever they need, and then the other player also know, okay, I cannot push too much, because definitely that will push the smaller state toward the other end. So this, whether that, if like the militarization and if the conflict increases, I don't think whether sorry, whether they will be pushed for choosing side would be a major concern. The final challenge I see, which is all the time, is the challenge of being influenced and always experiencing intervention from these major powers towards their domestic political affairs. Now, this we have seen throughout in South Asian region, especially there are enough experience in Sri Lanka alone because of Indian where India has influenced in one way or the other to domestic affairs in Sri Lanka. And India sort of has a structural arrangement to intervene or influence matters concerning foreign policy and security of Nepal and Bhutan. So whether this will be intensified. Now, we know that even when every time, for instance, when Nepal has tried to sort of like distance itself from this sort of intervention, there has been always pushback from India and major repercussions for such policies. So I think the main challenges are these for South Asian region. So it would be really interesting to know whether the small states in the Pacific region face similar challenges, or whether they have similar opportunities. So that's about it.
Dr. Chilani, for your wonderful presentation. Yeah, like you did a wonderful analysis from multipolarity to the multilateralism, and how you told in your presentation that how the small states have opportunity with this major power competition as well as have concerns too. So I have questions for you, like how do you view the huge investment of China in Sri Lanka? Is it as essentially benign, or should it raise concerns regarding Sri Lanka's sovereignty?
Well, I think it's I can give you a very long answer. I hope that is okay. Now, at the beginning, so let me come back with an explanation of how Chinese investment started pouring into Sri Lanka, because I think that gives an important context. So China and Sri Lanka, of course, have had a very historical relationship that was going for centuries, but actually the more recent relationship, that this level of relationship started in 2004, 2005, like. Now, this is a very interesting period that has several domestic and international incidents happened. Domestically, there was a government change where President Mahinda Rajapaksa became the leader of the country. His government had an agenda to militarily defeat the LTTE and end the terrorism in the country. As a result of which, Sri Lanka faced tension from the West, and its traditional allies distanced itself, like Japan, World Bank, etc. During the same period, China gets into World Trade Organization, and it starts this massive going outward kind of policy, where they invest in countries that they have not invested before, and also they have been growing at double digits. So that also happened. The second, and then finally, it was also the financial crisis. So all these things, I think, gave China an opportunity to enter Sri Lanka and increase its financial presence. So it was a mutual interest for China and Sri Lanka at that time. About the question of denial, whether it's denial or whether it's a threat for sovereignty, I think that depends on how Sri Lankan government manage this relationship. Obviously, Sri Lanka has a massive requirement for infrastructure investment, and most of the international organizations like IMF, World Bank do not provide such funding for Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka is not a lower income country anymore. It's a middle income country. So there is a change of these terms and conditions. But then Sri Lanka has to find the funding somewhere. So that's where China's funding has been very beneficial. But then again, in terms of negotiation and dealings, I think the most important factor is how Sri Lankan government should be transparent in its dealing. And then I think all these doubts about sovereignty, whether it's a threat to sovereignty or not, can be addressed properly.
Thank you so much for your answer and for your presentation. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Chilani. Thank you very much. I will take more on the questions. Thank you for your presentation. Now I would like to invite Dr. Ernest Gunasekara-Rockwell. Doc, please.
Yeah, Indu, in the interest of time, we've got a ton of questions that have popped up over in the chat box, and I don't really have anything to add other than the fact that these have been amazing presentations. We've got Chilani's recorded interview as well. So if we have time after the end of the questions and stuff, I'll go ahead and share screen and pull her interview up so that we can share that with folks that want to stick around and listen to that. Otherwise, we'll just splice it into the show, and when we put it out there on YouTube, everyone can watch it at their leisure. But rather than me taking up a bunch of space that would be better suited for the questions, let me just hand it over to you for the questions. And if you need me to read anything, just let me know. I'll switch over to my bifocals and see if I can read this little text over there in the chat room. But I'll hand it back over to you.
Thanks. So let me start with asking the question to Dr. Stephen Nagy. What are the challenges for middle powers to play the role of balancers in US-China competition in Indo-Pacific?
This is a great question, and we've already seen the challenges emerge. There's an expression in Chinese that you kill the chicken to scare the monkey. And I think that the economic coercion against our Australian friends, the hostage diplomacy against Canadians, Japanese, even the informal economic sanctions that our South Korean friends experienced after the installation of the THAAD missile systems back in September 2017 are really good examples of how China tries to apply pressure to middle power friends and partners of the United States. And the message is that they're trying to send is that, if you are leaning towards the United States and you're not differential to the views of Beijing, that this will create a challenge. We will penalize you. And for middle powers, they need to be conscious that they are potentially vulnerable to these kinds of tactics. The question going forward is how can middle powers collectively develop more resilience to these issues? And I think that one way, of course, is lobbying the United States and having a willing partner in the United States. And I think here the Biden administration and the comments of the Indo-Pacific czar, Kurt Campbell, saying that nothing's going to progress unless you stop coercion against our friends and partners, was an extremely important statement that was made to our Chinese colleagues. And that, I think there are that middle powers need to continue. And again, like I said, we're not only coming together to push back against China, we need to push the United States in positive directions that also protect our interests. And I think this is a critical area that middle powers need to continue to work on, is pushing China in a positive direction and also pushing our partner, our long-term comprehensive partner, the United States, in a positive direction. And I think what this means is middle powers stepping up to the plate, increasing their burden sharing within their partnership with the United States, as the Australians have done. And I really congratulate the Australians at stepping up to the plate and shouldering more of the burden. I think by doing that and ensuring the United States is successful in their policy implementation, but also balanced in their policy implementation, will pay dividends to middle powers in the Indo-Pacific. I'll stop there.
And thanks, Dr. Nagy. I would like to ask Professor Gresh, much has been made of the importance of the maritime domain in the Indo-Pacific. However, much less attention is given to the air and space domains in the region. Why is that? And what, if anything, can proponents of air and space powers do to alter that imbalance?
Yeah, thanks very much. Another good question. I think certainly, yes, there's been focus and attention on the maritime domain. However, I think there's also been a lot of focus on the air and space domain. If you talk to any Air Force guys, they talk about the ADISs, which is essentially the airspace over, of course, we saw, Taiwan in the last week. So there is a concern and a focus, but more to the point, especially on the space front, I mean, there's good reason why, the United States putting together a space force, because they understand and appreciate the technology and the advancements that have gone on over the past decade on the Chinese front, just technologically by private corporations and companies and the United States, and that's why they're very much concerned because of these capabilities. They could equally, it's one hand to say certainly the maritime domain, but in the space domain, there's a real threat and a concern there, and you can better believe that a lot of folks are thinking pretty robustly about what to do about it.
Thanks, Professor Gresh. Now, I have a question for Professor Dean. Like, how does Southeast Asia matter in Australia's Indo-Pacific strategy? What efforts has Australia been making to entice Southeast Asian nations?
Thank you for that good question. So very much in terms of Australia's strategic policy, the two key areas of focus for Australia have always been, because of geography, is Southeast Asia and the South Pacific. So Australia recently under this government announced what they called a Pacific Step Up. That's a refocusing their efforts on the South Pacific. particularly vis-a-vis infrastructure and greater Chinese encroachment and engagement into the region. But the big question has been, for those of us, and particularly myself, who are very focused on the Southeast Asian question, a bit concerning that there hasn't been an equitable sort of Southeast Asian step up. Certainly when the Australian government announced the Pacific step up, this was around infrastructure, diplomacy, military engagement, etc. But there was no new money for that particular program. And when we actually dug into where the Australian government got the money from to fund that particular initiative, they'd pretty much taken money out of their engagement in other regions and other parts of the globe. And particularly, they'd taken some funding out of the Southeast Asia area, which, while the South Pacific is always critically important, and Australia plays a major role because of its size, weight, and influence in that region. On a comparative basis, in terms of where Australian trade goes, where its strategic interests are, where its key strategic geographies, Southeast Asia is much more important. As I did mention, though, in my discussion, beyond the now development of a strategic partnership with India, which happened last year, Australia's also signed strategic partnerships on an economic, defence and security basis in the last couple of years with Singapore, with Malaysia and with Indonesia, and they've been particularly critical. Australia's obviously relationship with Indonesia is really key to its local and regional security efforts. We're doing much more there on joint interests in maritime security. But there's still an issue for Australia in terms of the depth of its trade relationship and other relationships. And it can be very positive, the relationship with Indonesia, but it has a long history with it that's sometimes a bit tense and a bit fractured. So, but it's great to see that we now got a free trade agreement with Indonesia, that we've got a more comprehensive strategic partnership with Indonesia. We've very much advanced our relations with Singapore very closely. The Singaporean military now does a significant amount of their training at Australian military training areas, given the ability to use our size and our space that we have there. They pre-position equipment in Australia, and we've really developed a much greater depth of military-to-military cooperation. The other thing that Australia has done to try and deepen its engagement, it runs an Indo-Pacific Endeavour enterprise every year, and that now alternates between a focus sort of on the South Pacific and out into Hawaii and working with the United States that way, and into the Indian Ocean, into Southeast Asia. So that swaps around, and that's a very big military diplomacy exercise that runs for a significant period of the year that we operate now, which is a new initiative. So we have done a fair bit with Southeast Asia. It is a critical focus for Australia. It's our backyard. It's where we need to pay more attention. But I do think we could actually be a lot more coordinated. And of course, what our endeavour has been for the 70-odd years of the ANZUS Alliance has been is hassling the United States of America to pay more attention to Southeast Asia. We see that as our core interest, and of course, we've been very keen to get more US involvement into the region as well. And that's been a core focus of Australian strategic policy.
Professor Gresh, great answer. Now I would like to take the one question for Dr. Panda, then I will take the questions from the audience, and if time allows, then I will come back with my question. Dr. Panda, like, how are India's national interest and global aspirations be fitted with multipolar world?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of debate about what kind of world order India would like to see. And I think for a long time, India is asking about a multipolar world order. That means we are, India as a power is looking for a universal engagement with all sort of powers, be it major powers or middle-ranked powers, or in fact, smaller countries in the neighborhood regions. And that is one issue that India in its foreign policy dialogues is continuously trying to make it for last one and a half decade. The second thing that needs to be really noted about when we're talking about a multipolar world order is India's engagement process with not only the nearer neighborhood countries, the smaller economies, but also the smaller economies which are far away. For example, in Indian foreign policy today, we see a kind of a engagement with the far smaller countries in the African Union, in the African continent, which is a a big statement in Indian foreign policy. And in over the last 10 years or so, we see that India is emerging as a much more effective power in the African region. The third element that is really needs to be noted about India's multipolar argument is that I think what India is continuously trying to make a point is that external major powers, they may not be from Asia, but they must be engaged with Asia, and their presence in Asia must be welcome. For example, United States of America, it might not necessarily be an Asian power, but its presence in Asian continent is very much welcomed. Unlike the Chinese, which is really opposing the American presence in Asia, and the way actually Xi Jinping few years back, talked about Asia for Asians, India does oppose to that conception. And I think India's multipolar concept of Asia is all about welcoming extra territorial powers to Asia and to stay engaged about a process which is, multipolar in nature. In fact, about European Union, countries like France, countries like Germany, they have a lot to contribute to the Asian regions in terms of infrastructure, in terms of maritime planning, in terms of blue economy, in terms of trying to address the human development index in the regions, human development human development issues in terms of trying to bring out practical infrastructural development in South Asian regions or within India itself. So I think what India in essence is trying to make is that to welcome extraterritorial powers to stay engaged with Asia. So we don't really talk about a unipolar Asia. India is talking about a multipolar Asia through engagement and through sharing through a shared partnership. And I think this is what India and Indian government is trying to continuously build in its foreign policy, which is really a opposing trend to the China's unilateral practices that Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership is trying to promote over the last 2 decades or so.
Thank you, Dr. Panda. We have in our chat box, we have a question from the reporter Dong Kim. Would you like to ask a question by yourself? Let me read. Yep.
Can
Go
you
ahead.
hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Oh, wait a minute. So, well, so and now, so even though the PRC is the greatest facing threat in the region, this does not mean existential threat risks from other secondary threats are gone. South Korea entering their presidential elections set for next year. Already, some presidential candidates have proposed pledges to address the regional nuclear imbalance induced by North Korea, and obviously say that that also includes PRC as well. An array of proposal ranges from nuclear planning group to formation of NATO-like nuclear sharing arrangement, which includes South Korea, United States, Japan, and Australia. How does the panelists assess the current imbalance in the region, and do you see a proposed multilateral deterrence mechanism, nuclear planning group, or multilateral nuclear sharing feasible option?
Indu, you might need to reread that out of the chat box. That was a little difficult to follow with the feedback.
Okay, let me read the question like this. Here, the question is about the nuclear imbalance in the region, and how do you see such proposal of multilateral deterrence mechanisms, such as nuclear planning group or multilateral nuclear sharing, a feasible option, considering, unlike Europe, Asia heavily relied on a US-led hub and spoke architecture. So it's about a nuclear imbalance. If any of my experts want to say something on this. Yeah, Professor Nagy.
Thank you very much, Kim, for your question. So I think that when we're talking about weapons proliferation within the region, we have 2 kinds. We have, of course, North Korea developing its own ICBM missile systems, as well as short, mid, and long-range delivery systems. So these systems are primarily targeted at US bases that are peppered through the region, and the Japanese archipelago, Guam, Saipan, and of course, the homeland of the United States. So this is one nuclear problem that we need to face. China, on the other hand, we don't know what kind of problem is emerging out of China. Over the past few months, we've had some reports and satellite images of silos being developed in Xinjiang and other parts of China. We don't know what the nuclear strategy of China is at this particular moment. It used to be on a minimum deterrence capability, but what we see is potentially a shift in that approach to its own nuclear defense approach. So I think that we need to, again, separate the North Korean aspect of nuclear weapons proliferation within the region to what's happening in China, and is China fundamentally shifting its position? Let me add that the reticence of the former administration in the United States they ended the agreement on intermediate missile systems for the specific reason is that China was not part of a broader global agreement on missiles, missile control, like the former Soviet Union or Russia and the United States. So we have a lot of different issues emerging within the region. What do we do about missile development, intermediate missile development? What do we do about the North Korean nuclear development? And then how do we understand China's shifting posture on nuclear deterrence? And these are three separate problems that will require cooperation and dialogue rather than taking them on collectively. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Nagy. There is a question from Nathan Wilson for Professor Gresh. You mentioned the importance of underwater cables for communication security. In the past, China has damaged sea cables using sea dredging around Taiwan. What are the odds something like this can continue to happen and possible hinder Quad nations?
Yeah, I think it's always a concern at some level. You know, I think certainly right now it's not to be overly alarmist, but as I cited, these cables can easily be cut. And if they're cut, they'd have significant repercussions for any country. And that's why, you know, certainly seeing China being very smart about it, again, from a geoeconomic standpoint, I'm going to invest in resilient lines so that in the event that they are cut or something happens, that I can easily offload and ensure that communications move seamlessly. In addition to that, and again, we see this in the United States, but seeing private entities like Google, for example, runs a cable across the transatlantic, and they'll see, you know, anything like 50 repairs that need to be made in a given year. So clearly the cables are in constant kind of, you know, there's a work rhythm to them. There's a certain vulnerability, but I think you can better believe that all nations, especially those who are tracking, you know, and have the capabilities to really follow and see where they're coming up, are watching and know in the event that something really grave were to happen. But I think, you know, barring a larger conflict, you know, it gets back to a complex interdependence argument where we all rely upon these submarine cables, and so not to do anything about it. But I get in certain situations like Taiwan, certainly that's a real vulnerability.
Thanks, Professor Gresh, for your answer. Dear Wilson, Nathan Wilson, I will take your questions later if time allows. I'm taking another question from Simran Walia. I think that's for the Dr. Peter Dean. How does Japan view the emergence of the AUKUS?
Well, as I mentioned in my talk so far, it's been a very positive reaction from a significant number of countries in the region, particularly the Quad-based countries. As we've heard in the discussion today, Australia is developing much deeper relations with, through the Quad, but also with each of those countries individually, as well as more broadly, the countries around the region. I think another key factor just to sort of highlight here is, as I said in the OSMIN meeting that was held, Australia not only spoke about all the things that I mentioned, but particularly the OSMIN meeting highlighted the expanded cooperation with Five Eyes intelligence groupings, which is interesting, but particularly and specifically mentioned the trilateral strategic dialogue with Japan, and the trilateral defence minister meetings with Japan as being really key. So the response from Japan has been very positive, and this accords with the greater depth and development of both the trilateral relationship and the bilateral relationship and the Quad relationship.
Thank you, Professor Dean. Now another question, I'm taking it, I guess we have done with our time, but maybe that can be the last question for our experts. At what stand could the middle powers, such as India, Japan, Australia, have with respect to the new Taliban government, and how could they collaborate on the same amidst diverging national interest? Any of from the experts? Yeah, Dr. Panda, please go ahead.
Yes, I think, we know for a fact that middle powers has different outlooks towards many problematic issues in the regions. But Taliban issue is one such issue. I think all the middle powers probably will share a convergence views, primarily for a number of regions. The current situation in Taliban is not really conducive for peace and stability. So therefore, all the three countries, India, Australia, and Japan, or for that context, most of the middle powers, they would like to see that peace prevails in the regions as soon as possible. So therefore, without really, going out of the way, try to acknowledge the Taliban government and try to recognize it as a formal, government in Afghanistan. And I think what all of these middle powers would like to do is to stay engaged with the interim government in Taliban, trying to negotiate with them and trying to convince and make it sure that probably not to associate with the problematic groups, with the radical groups, with the terrorist groups. The Haqqani network should be tackled, the Al-Qaeda should be condemned, and the interim government in Taliban should disassociate itself. And therefore, on this issue, most of the middle powers, be it India, Japan, Australia, or any, for that matter, any other middle powers would really share the complementary. The other issue is, and I think this is again a long-term issue, is about the reconstruction of Afghanistan or rebuilding process of the Afghanistan. And I think if we talk about India and Japan particularly, both has been on the similar platform. Japan has invested a lot in Afghanistan, even though it's not a key security provider to Afghanistan. Over the last 2 decades, Japan has significantly contributed to the development of Afghanistan. Similarly, India, has also engaged in terms of, construction process of the schools, of the hospitals, and also the human resource development in the country. So therefore, I think most of these countries would like that the human life, the human resource development in Afghanistan should not suffer, even though there has been strict, observance of about not releasing the economy or the finance to the Afghanistan regions so quickly, and the world is still very carefully monitoring and not to give unnecessarily and undue finance without the interim government of Taliban taking any preventive actions to disturb the peace and stability in the regions. But I think all of these countries are also sure, India, Japan, Australia, and most of the middle powers, they're sure that at some point they have to talk to the interim government in Taliban in order to, trying to protect the human life there and trying to restore the human development. And that is critical towards the reconstruction process of Afghanistan. And this is where all the middle powers would share the complementarities and probably start talking. In fact, what we saw during the Quad process also, Afghanistan issue and the Taliban issue is being discussed. So therefore, there are a number of issues all of these powers would like to discuss, and it is a continuous process. There is no immediate action plans which will be implemented in Afghanistan. But yes, the things are in progress. Probably some of these powers shares complementarities on the issue of the Taliban and Afghanistan.
Thank you, Dr. Dr. Nagy, you want to say something on that?
Yes, thank you. Frankly, I think it's too early to tell. We don't really know where the Taliban will be in terms of the kind of governance structure it will have over the next 6 or 7 months. We're entering the winter season, which will create an enormous burden in terms of governance and challenge the new temporary or interim government. And I think that we'll be better placed to understand the kinds of needs that Afghanistan will have, the openness of the Afghanistan Taliban regime in terms of international aid, and will they be able to guarantee the safety of middle powers or other powers in terms of the provision of aid within the region. So I think Afghanistan is a really important issue, but I don't think we can look at it today. I think we have to look at it in 6 months, maybe a year. And I think that we also need to think about some of the other actors within the region. Pakistan has lost all its leverage now that the Taliban have come into power. What will Pakistan do? Will they support extremism, and how will that affect India? Will India be an accommodating middle power towards Afghanistan if Pakistan is going to continue to support extremism in the region? It's a very complicated issue, but it's just too early to tell. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nagy. I would like to say that thank you, Professor Gresh. I just want to thank from bottom of my heart that you accept the invitation and to be here. I know it's your class time, so I would like to invite Dr. Ernest Gunasekara-Rockwell for his concluding remarks. Please.
Yeah, thank you to everyone for participating, for those that are presenters and for those that were asking the fine questions out from the audience. I know it never seems like we have enough time to get to all of the ones that pop up in the chat box, and we apologize for that. What we try to do with those is, we revisit a lot of the same topics, from time to time, because things change. And what we like to do with the questions that we get in the chat box that we don't have time to get to is we try to recycle those when we come around to the next iteration of our discussions. So if we didn't get around to asking it this time, we'll do our best to get it to it next time. And if you want it to be sent directly to one of the panelists from today, just let me know. We can easily get in touch with all of them. Not a problem at all. But again, thank you to our panelists. You all brought something unique and valuable to the discussion today. And I appreciate your willingness to be with us. It's definitely helping to build the consortium's reputation for providing quality programming and for bringing very valuable insights into the discussion of everything Indo-Pacific. So thank you very much from the consortium, and thank you very much from the journal. Obviously, I encourage all of you to take the thoughts that you put down today and put it on paper and submit it to me for publication in the journal. That would be fantastic. Open invitation to all of you. So thank you, and I'll turn it back over to you, Indu.
Thank you, Doc. Thank you, Professor Gresh. Thank you, Professor Dean. Thank you, Professor Nagy, Dr. Panda, and Dr. Chulani Atake. Thank you for your wonderful presentation and to be here. Thank you, our operational team, and particularly Doc for your guidance and your mentorship. Thank you very much.